Okay, this video is about dependent measure t-tests, or sometimes called repeated measure t-tests. These are tests where you have someone who has taken a has a measure on a first part and a second part of something. So basically, two measurements on the same scale, separated by time. And so in this case, and in most cases, what you would see would be something like a pre-test, post-test, and whether that's like you took something at the beginning of a class, at the end of a class, or the beginning of a semester, at the end of a semester, or maybe you took something maybe when you were 5 years old and they measured again when you were 10 years old, something like that, just to see how the change occurs from person to person. So it doesn't necessarily compare whole groups to whole groups, it compares people to people. And so that's an important difference in these types of tests. So what I've done is I've set up a pre-test, post-test measurement here in SPSS. I just wrote pre-test, post-test. You might see it in many different ways, but this is the basics of what it would be. These are both scale measurement variables. They're interval or ratio variables, things that you can average. And we've got pre-test, post-test. So basically, let's say person 6 scored a 91 on the pre-test and a 99 on the post-test. All right, so the question we're asking here is there improvement between the pre-test and post-test? So we look at that and say, let's run a repeated measures or a dependent t-test. So we go down to compare means, we go to analyze, compare means, and we have a repeated measures, or we have what's called a paired samples t-test. You can hear it called all three different ways, I guess. Paired samples, repeated measures, or dependent t-test, where you have independent, well, this would be dependent, or also paired samples t-test. So we go to paired samples. All right, let's reset that. That way you can see the whole thing in action. What you need to do is pick out your pair, and you can go variable 1, variable 2, or you can just select both. Just hold down the shift key or hold down the control key, but then just pick both and move them both over. All right, or you can drag them over in newer versions of SPSS, where you have pre-test as variable 1, post-test as variable 2, or you can just click them over. Post-test goes over, pre-test goes over, post-test goes over. So that's all you have to do necessarily that way. Now once you get it in, I think in newer versions as well, you can kind of flip them around with this little button here. You can, if you had more than one, you could move up the order in how you did it, but we're comfortable here, pre-test, post-test, and we hit OK to run it. And here's what our output looks like. Now it's got a little extra stuff in there, and basically it's just running a correlation to show you what the differences are, or what the relationships are between your variables. Okay, so what we have, same things up here: mean, standard deviation, and n for each one. So for the pre-test, the average was 84.56 with a standard deviation of 6.83. Post-test, 92.12 with a standard deviation of 5.00. Down here, it tells you what your paired differences are. Now, the first part tells you what the differences between your groups are, which is just post-test minus pre-test minus post-test, so negative 7.56, meaning that there was a 7.56 increase between the pre-test and post-test, with that sort of standard deviation for the differences, and then your 95% confidence and your standard error of the mean. So this is not necessarily what we need to report. Over here is what we report. We have our t-value, our degrees of freedom, and our two-tailed significance. Now remember, our test was if it was higher, if there was an improvement between pre-test and post-test. So we would actually have to reduce this by half to move it into two-tailed, but since it is already that small, it only shows up as 0.000. Now what I want to show you real quick is that this does not mean that p equals 0. So don't ever report it as p equals 0. Instead, if you can double click on it, and then you can go in here and double click as well, if you double click, you see that that actually is a number, 0.000221. That's the actual p-value. So don't think that that means that it's actually 0. It just means that it ran out of room until it got, or it printed as many zeros as it had until it got to a number. And so since there was more zeros than there were later on, more places to get to, then it just reported the first 3 digits, 0.000, and it couldn't get to the other 221. So it just reported the first 3 digits. Okay, but for you, when you see that, all you need to think is that it's less than 0.001. When you divide that by 2, it's still less than 0.001, so that's how we would report it, less than 0.01. Perfectly fine. Okay, so let's work on how to report it. Let's put a little text box in here, and we can report it. Now, we're talking about pre-test and post-test, so something as simple as there was significant improvement between pre-test scores and post-test scores. Okay, now what we need to do is put in the means and standard deviations. So for pre-test scores, let's put the means and standard deviations in. All right, so mean, italicized capital M, equals 84.56, and standard deviation equals 6.83. And for post-test scores, we have mean equals 92.12, and standard deviation equals 5.00. And again, I just got those from right up here. Mean, standard deviation, mean, standard deviation. Now we need to report our test statistics since we said it's a significant difference. And then to do that, we just do a comma, italics, we do an italics here. We do a lowercase t, and then we put our degrees of freedom in there, 24, which we got from right here. Close your parentheses, equals your t statistic, negative 4.34. And then since our p-value is just less than 0.000 whatever, all right, so it's less than 0.001, all right, we would just put that it's less than 0.01, 2 decimal places. P in italicized lowercase p is less than 0.01. And that's all we would have to do to report it in APA style, a significant result. Okay, so there's a significant improvement between pre-test scores, mean standard deviation, and post-test scores, mean standard deviation, comma, test statistic.